no one could forget the sight of Chrissy Amphlett storming the stage in her schoolgirl uniform, snarling into the microphone with a mix of defiance and seduction that scandalized the establishment and electrified her fans. She was more than a singer. She was a cultural shockwave. But behind the makeup, the wild hair, and the provocative moves that defined an era, hid a life riddled with torment, secrets, and a slow descent into illness that would silence one of the most daring voices of Australian rock. What if I told you that the very woman who embodied rebellion and desire would spend her final years trapped not by critics or controversy, but by her own body turning against her? Chrissy Amphlett, the fearless frontwoman of the Divinyls, carried with her a reputation for scandal, and she wore it like armor. Yet the world rarely saw the fragility beneath that armor, the exhaustion of being misunderstood, and the haunting loneliness of a woman who gave everything to the stage while losing so much of herself off it. She shocked the world with her unapologetic sexuality, with anthems like "I Touch Myself" that forced entire generations to confront their taboos. She became a symbol of both empowerment and outrage. But when the lights faded, Chrissy faced the merciless trials of multiple sclerosis and breast cancer, a dual curse that stripped her of her power and ultimately her voice. This is not just the story of a rock star. This is the tale of a woman who burned too brightly, whose legacy was written in both scandal and suffering, and whose final truth reveals the cost of being unforgettable. She wasn't meant to be ordinary. Born in Geelong, Victoria, in 1959, Christine Joy Amphlett grew up in a conservative environment that seemed worlds away from the defiant, sexually charged performer she would later become. Her early years were steeped in discipline. She sang in the church choir, studied ballet, and was drawn to the structure of classical music. But even then, there were signs of a storm brewing beneath the surface. Chrissy didn't want to follow the rules. She wanted to break them. By the late 1970s, she had already begun to reject the mold of the good girl. After a bold stint in Spain, where she was jailed for singing on the streets, she returned to Australia with a hardened edge and a fire in her eyes. It was this hunger for rebellion that led her to Sydney's underground music scene, where she met guitarist Mark McEntee. Together, they would form Divinyls, a band that would come to define Chrissy's legacy and reshape the sound of Australian rock. The early 1980s were a volatile time in Australia's music and cultural landscape. The rise of punk and new wave clashed with lingering conservatism, and female performers were still expected to behave, smile, and sing sweetly. Chrissy Amphlett did none of that. With smeared red lipstick, ripped fishnet stockings, and a gaze that dared anyone to look away, she shattered every expectation. On stage, she was raw, unfiltered, and magnetic, often crawling, spitting, and screaming her way through songs about obsession, lust, and rage. But this provocative persona didn't come without backlash. Critics labeled her a bad influence. Feminist scholars were divided. Some hailed her as a fearless pioneer of female sexuality, while others condemned her for reinforcing male fantasies. Audiences either worshipped her or walked out in shock. Yet Chrissy leaned into the controversy, crafting a career that thrived on discomfort. In doing so, she paid a high personal price. The tension between performance and person, between empowerment and exploitation, would come to define Chrissy's public image. While her band climbed charts and toured internationally, her offstage life was often a battleground of depression, addiction, and isolation. Few understood the toll it took to play the role of a provocateur night after night, year after year. Fewer still knew how much of her act was a shield, one that hid a deeply sensitive soul who longed to be heard for her music, not just her image. As Divinyls reached global fame with hits like Pleasure and Pain and I Touch Myself, Chrissy Amphlett became an icon, but also a lightning rod. Behind the flashing cameras and sold-out shows, the foundations of her life began to crack. The very persona that made her unforgettable was also the one that kept her locked in a prison of public perception. And while the world saw a fierce, unbreakable woman, they had no idea what was silently beginning to break her from within. After Divinyls formed in the early 80s, their reputation grew just as fast as their notoriety. Chrissy's theatrical stage presence, complete with manic expressions, angry whispers, and seductive lunges, was something Australia had never seen. The band's breakout came with their contribution to the film Monkey Grip in 1982, and soon after, they were a household name. But fame didn't soften Chrissy, it intensified her extremes. By the time Pleasure and Pain hit the charts in 1985, the world was watching. Chrissy's voice, equal parts snarl and seduction, carried the agony of experience. Her lyrics weren't poetic abstractions, they were raw confessions. In interviews, she came off as disarmingly honest, even abrasive. She didn't filter herself for the sake of public approval, and the media couldn't get enough. One week, she was praised as a feminist trailblazer. The next, she was demonized for being too much, too sexual, too aggressive, too unstable. The friction within Divinyls mirrored the chaos of Chrissy's inner world. Her creative relationship with Mark McEntee was as combustible as it was brilliant. They fought viciously, broke up romantically, got back together musically, and endured stretches of silence that lasted for years. But when they played, there was magic. Their dysfunction became part of the band's mythology, a never-ending push and pull that kept their sound volatile and alive. As they reached the peak of their success in the early 90s, I Touch Myself took the band to international fame. It was provocative, controversial, and completely Chrissy. The song wasn't just about sex, it was a woman claiming agency over her own body and desires. It shocked radio stations. It was banned in parts of the US. It became an anthem. But with that anthem came labels Chrissy could never shake: raunchy, scandalous, deviant. The success brought attention, but also pressure. She developed severe stage fright and began drinking heavily to cope. Friends noticed her health deteriorating, but Chrissy waved off concerns. She had always lived with a sense of defiance, as if daring the world to break her. She had survived Spain, fame, heartbreak, addiction. She believed she could survive anything. But then came the slow, invisible breakdown. Her legs would occasionally fail her. Her balance was off. The voice that once roared began to strain. Doctors initially misdiagnosed her. For years, she performed through the pain, unwilling to step back, unwilling to let the audience see her weaken. But deep inside, something was changing. Her illness was creeping in silently, just as the spotlight began to fade. Public interest was moving on. The grunge era had arrived. Chrissy Amphlett, once the most dangerous woman in Australian music, now found herself confronting an even more relentless force: time. And as the stages got smaller and the headlines fewer, the cracks that had been forming for years finally broke wide open. The fall didn't come suddenly. It was slow, cruel, and deeply personal. For someone who had lived so much of her life with fire and noise, Chrissy Ampflett's decline felt like a brutal silence tightening around her. It began with a diagnosis that shattered whatever illusions of invincibility remained: multiple sclerosis. Her body, once the instrument of wild energy and sexual defiance on stage, was now rebelling against her in secret. She tried to hide it at first, as if sheer force of will could undo the truth. But soon, the tremors grew harder to conceal. Walking became difficult. Her hands, once wrapped tightly around microphones and clenched in electric passion, began to fail her. And yet she refused to stop. She still performed, still pushed through, still screamed into the darkness, even as it closed in around her. Then, another blow. In 2010, Chrissy revealed she had also been diagnosed with breast cancer. One devastating illness was not enough. Fate had given her two. This time, it was harder to pretend. Her voice, her weapon, her identity grew weak. She could no longer sing the way she once did. For someone whose entire existence had been performance, whose pain had always been alchemized into sound, the silence was unbearable. In interviews, she was raw and unsparing. "I have to sleep sitting up because of the pain in my spine," she confessed. "But I still feel lucky." There was no false hope, no shiny optimism, just brutal honesty, the kind that had always defined her. Behind the bluntness was a woman exhausted by the fight, yet still unwilling to surrender her dignity. The media, which had once hounded her for scandal, now watched from a distance. Australia mourned in slow motion. There were tributes, magazine covers, benefit concerts, but Chrissy didn't want sympathy. She wanted to be remembered for the battles she chose, not the ones forced upon her. Her final years were spent with her husband, drummer Charlie Drayton, in New York. Far from the spotlight, she faced her illnesses in relative privacy. But even then, she used her story to advocate. She became a voice for breast cancer awareness. She wanted women to take their health seriously. She turned even her suffering into a kind of protest against silence, against shame, against invisibility. When she passed away in April 2013 at just 53, it wasn't just a musician who died. It was an era. Fans flooded social media with tributes. Fellow musicians called her a trailblazer. But what lingered most were the images. Chrissy, sneering into the microphone, eyes blazing, unrepentant. And then Chrissy, thin, fragile, but still upright, still fighting. The truth was finally clear. Beneath the scandal, the stardom, and the stage persona, there was a woman who had given everything. Her art, her body, her silence. She had turned her pain into performance. And when the curtain finally fell, what remained wasn't a scandal. It was sacrifice. Chrissy Amphlett was never easy to define. And that, perhaps, is why she was so often misunderstood. At Aussie Uncovered, we look back at her story not through the lens of scandal or shock value, but with the full weight of everything she dared to be. She wasn't polished, she wasn't agreeable, she wasn't safe. And yet, in her refusal to conform, she gave permission to an entire generation of women, artists and misfits alike, to be exactly who they were, without apology. It's tempting to view her legacy only through her hits or her controversies. But what if we look deeper? What if we saw Chrissy not as a provocateur, but as a survivor of an industry that punished women for being complex? She didn't exist for your comfort. She existed for truth, however messy, loud, or painful that truth may be. We believe that Chrissy's music, especially I Touch Myself, was more than a sexual statement. It was an act of reclaiming, of forcing conversations that society wasn't ready for. It was personal, political, and prophetic. And when she later used that same song to promote breast cancer awareness, it closed a circle few artists ever get to draw. That was Chrissy, bold enough to disrupt the system, and human enough to make it matter. There are those who still reduce her to a stage act, a scandalous figure in a schoolgirl uniform. But we remember the cost behind that image. The relentless touring, the fractured relationships, the pressure to always be shocking, to always deliver, even as her body collapsed. We remember the woman who sang through pain, who stood when she should have fallen, who found a way to turn even her suffering into purpose. What does Chrissy Amphlett mean to you? Is she a rebel, a cautionary tale, a forgotten icon? Or is she, like many great artists, someone we only truly understand once they're gone? Because in the end, Chrissy didn't want sainthood or pity. She wanted to be heard. And even now, years after her death, she still is. The story of Chrissy Amphlett doesn't end with her passing. If anything, that's when the echoes began. Soft at first, then louder, until they became impossible to ignore. Streets were named after her. Her voice returned in radio tributes. Fans, old and new, rediscovered Divinyls and found in Chrissy something fierce, something free, something gone too soon. But it wasn't just her music that endured. It was her presence. The way she stared down judgment. The way she turned vulnerability into theater. The way she made women feel seen, not for their perfection, but for their flaws, their fire, their fight. She gave them a blueprint for rebellion. Not the polished you see in commercials, but the real, ugly, beautiful kind that comes from living hard and feeling everything. Some stories are loud, others are whispered. Chrissy's was both. And now you know the truth behind the snarling smile, behind the stage lights and torn stockings. You know what it cost her to be unforgettable. You've heard the songs, but now you've heard the silence too. The one that came after the applause, after the headlines, after the world moved on. But here's the thing. Legends don't disappear. They haunt. They shimmer. They survive. And Chrissy Amphlett, Australia's most dangerous woman in rock, survives not just in records or tributes, but in the daring of every voice that refuses to be silenced. Because some voices never die. They just wait to be remembered.